Well, welcome everyone. My name is Lonnie Finskova, and I'm one of the employees who works here at the Mayo Clinic Cancer Education Center. And we are so happy to have Therese Schumacher here today. And she has worked at Mayo for almost 19 years. And she's currently the lead counselor for our Nicotine Dependence Center. And she's also the program director for the Tobacco Treatment Specialist Training Program, where people do learn how to work with people in the Nicotine Dependence Center to try and overcome their tobacco addictions. And so she works with people both in the hospital setting and also in the clinic setting. And she is going to talk to us about clearing the air on e-cigarettes, nicotine, and tobacco. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Yay.
Hello.
We've got a small audience, so this is good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about e-cigarettes, nicotine, and tobacco and the differences. So smoking is still the #1 cause of preventable death in the United States, and the estimates are at about 480,000 people every year in this country die from a smoking-related illness. And the numbers are higher for total tobacco use, but 480,000 people every year die in this country from a smoking-related illness. So if you were to put that in context, you think 480,000 people, what does that mean? Well, I look at it like this. It's equal to 1, 2, 3, 747 jetliners crashing every single day in this country with no survivors. So you would think, wouldn't you think that if we knew that 3 747 jetliners were crashing every day in this country for a year with no survivors, we'd do something about it? But here we are in the middle of a tobacco epidemic, and it's still considered a bad habit. So smoking rates have steadily decreased over the past 50 plus years since the first Surgeon General's report, which came out in 1964. But we still have a large problem in certain areas across the country. The lowest smoking rates, as you can see, are in California and Utah, with between 9 and 12% of the population. Minnesota holding around 15-16%, and then the highest populations of states that have smokers, tobacco users, are centered in the lower Midwest and eastern part of the country. Kentucky, Arkansas, West Virginia having some of the highest smoking rates. Throughout the country, though, the average smoking, about 1 in 15 people are still considered that still smoke, so about 15% nationwide. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the tobacco smoke and what it is that makes smoking so harmful. Cigarette smoke contains at least 6,000 different chemicals, and at least 60 of these chemicals have been classified as carcinogens, or things that cause cancer. And the composition of the processed tobacco in cigarettes influences the chemistry and the toxicity of the smoke. And so the problem with smoking isn't necessarily the nicotine, and I'll talk about nicotine in a minute. The problem with smoking is really the 6,000 different chemicals that are in the tobacco. But the nicotine is the drug that keeps people connected to the cigarette and is what keeps the addiction going. Nicotine by itself is not a carcinogen. It's liquid in its native state, and it's distilled from burning tobacco and carried on tar droplets. And the deal with nicotine when it's smoked is that inhalation is the fastest delivery route for the nicotine. And so anytime you think of a drug delivery device, cigarettes are the most effective drug delivery device known to man. And so they deliver that drug, nicotine, to somebody's brain within just a few heartbeats, within 8 to 10 seconds actually. And so the nicotine is delivered very quickly when somebody smokes. And that's what initiates this addiction. And so we here at Mayo Clinic treat tobacco dependence as a very powerful addiction. We also believe that it's a chronic disease, and it requires not only behavioral treatment, but also we use medications to help people beat this addiction. It's like any other chronic disease you might think of, like coronary heart disease, diabetes. You treat it with behavioral changes and medication alike. So the addiction component starts when somebody smokes through that very effective drug delivery device. The nicotine hits the brain, and up in the brain, once somebody starts smoking, they start growing these nicotine receptors that are found on the brain tissue. And the more somebody smokes, the more these nicotine receptors grow. And over the years of somebody continuing to smoke, they've got maybe millions of those nicotine receptors in their brain, and they fill up with nicotine very quickly. And the thing with nicotine is when somebody smokes, nicotine leaves the system very quickly, like within 2 hours. So those receptors are filled up, and then within 2 hours, those receptors start emptying out. And when those receptors start emptying out, that's what causes the urges, the cravings, the physical dependence that people have on tobacco. And so what happens is they smoke, fills them up again. So it's a very vicious cycle. And over the years, those receptors have memory. So they get to the point where for somebody that is smoking a pack a day, that's how much their brain needs in a day to make sure those receptors are filled, and so that that person isn't going through withdrawal. So basically every time somebody goes out to have a cigarette, they're just filling up those nicotine receptors to prevent themselves from going through withdrawal. Eventually, after somebody quits, the receptors downregulate. They don't ever go away. So somebody that quits smoking, and they've quit for, maybe a number of years, the memory of those receptors are always there. So sometimes people say, geez, I haven't smoked for about 8 years, but I walked into the restaurant that I used to smoke at, and it's a trigger for them. And so it's a very powerful thing. It's a very powerful addiction. And so here's another picture of the nicotine receptors that they upregulate when somebody starts smoking. A person who's never smoked in their life doesn't develop these nicotine receptors. But if you think about, the target of the tobacco industry is still geared towards adolescents. And you think about an adolescent's brain that's still developing and forming, and when they start using tobacco or an e-cigarette at a young age, they're getting nicotine delivered into their system, and so they start developing these nicotine receptors. And that changes the brain chemistry. And so adolescents can become very addicted to tobacco, cigarettes, e-cigarettes very quickly. Usually within 1 to 2 years of an adolescent having, experimenting with their first cigarette or tobacco use, within 1 to 2 years they become addicted. So when I talked about the medication, we really believe in utilizing medications to help people quit because, again, we know that the nicotine isn't the problem. The problem with the smoking is the thousands of chemicals in the tobacco. And this just gives an example of when somebody smokes a cigarette, again, that nicotine hits the brain very, very quickly. Compared to somebody using some of the products that are out there to help people quit, such as the patch, the nasal spray, the inhaler, the gum. Those are all common products that deliver nicotine, but it's a much different delivery route, and a much smaller amount of nicotine is delivered. When somebody smokes, the nicotine is delivered through the arterial bloodstream, whereas the nicotine delivered through the products is through the venous bloodstream, and so it's a much slower delivery route. But what it does in the brain is it tricks those receptors into thinking that somebody is still smoking by providing them small amounts of nicotine. Eventually, again, if somebody's quitting and they're using the products, eventually those receptors downregulate. But it takes a few months. So we tell people the longer that you're using these products, the better. A counselor that used to work in our department, Tom Gauvin, said, it's a disease. It's not a bad person with a bad habit, but a good person with a difficult disease. And, people try to quit smoking. Each year, 20 million smokers try to stop with limited success. only 2 to 3% of people that try to quit smoking the first time are still abstinent at a year. And successful quitters have quit and relapsed 5 or more times on average. And this is where help comes in. We know that somebody that seeks the help of counseling, along with the proper use of the medications, their chances are at least twice as likely to be able to quit and stay quit than somebody who just decides to quit and goes to buy patches over the counter. We know that counseling and the help available is really what works to help people quit. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about e-cigarettes for a few minutes. E-cigarettes have really been around for a long time, but they first came into the scene in the country around 2003. They were developed by a Chinese pharmacist. His name was Han Lick, and he was a smoker, and his father died from cigarette smoke, and so he was really interested in developing something that might help people to quit smoking but resemble the same thing as a cigarette. And so vaping is what it's called, to inhale vapor from an e-cigarette. It's interesting to note that even the name of vaping is different than smoking, and so right away, you know, I like to think of it as a new dog, but the same old tricks as cigarette smoking. So vaping is a term that's used, and oftentimes people that start using an e-cigarette, again, a lot of the targeting with the marketing industry is to the adolescents. They think it's different than smoking, and so they're intrigued because it's not smoking, it's something called vaping. But what is an electronic nicotine delivery system? That's what we call the e-cigarettes. It's really a battery-powered device that provides inhaled doses of vaporized nicotine solution along with a bunch of other flavorants and solvents. And so this picture here is a picture of a first-generation e-cigarette. Back here there's cotton that kind of holds the e-juice or the liquids. There's a heater which vaporizes the nicotine. There's a microprocessor, it controls the heat and the light at the end. And then in the middle here is a battery, lithium battery. E-cigarettes are getting more difficult to classify as one product. There's hundreds of different brands, and there's now, you know, up here on you see 7,764 unique flavors. There's more than that at this time. One of the problems with the e-cigarettes is right now there's no regulations. And so all these unique flavors and the various liquids, there's no regulation. And so people could really be mixing these chemicals in their basement for all we know, just because of, you know, there's no regulation. So it's really buyer beware. And I like to think of it as the wild, wild west of e-cigarettes right now, because nobody really knows. Again, I also like to say that it's a new dog, but possibly the same old tricks as when they first found out information about the smoking. So here again, a picture of the first generation e-cigarettes. Those were disposable. You can still find some of those around. But now, kind of grown in the e-cigarette world, the second generation were these devices that you'd fill with the liquids. And so these liquids are down here at the bottom, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a second. And then now you have the third and fourth generation, and these generation of e-cigarettes are even more complex. They have varying voltages and watts of power, and you know, you can deliver various amounts of nicotine and different solvents into your lungs if you like. And the third and fourth generation ones are much more expensive than they were when they first came out. And then you see these vape shops kind of growing and, you know, developing and showing up in different places across the country. People, often young adults, go to these shops and they buy different flavors of the different liquids, the e-juices, and then they spend a lot of time talking about their e-cigarettes and all the things that go along with using one. So one of the concerns is, are e-cigarettes a gateway drug? Are people actually using them to help them quit smoking? a few studies out show that the e-cigarette use among youth, these youth were almost twice as likely to have intentions to smoke conventional cigarettes. And over 1 year, the use of cigarettes was significantly associated with the progression along the trajectory to smoking cigarettes. So here's a little more information on that. This study was conducted in 2015. It shows at the bottom in the blue, middle school students from 2012 to when, in 2013, to when the very first these Ruan and Enjoy e-cigarettes were like first generation e-cigarettes. And now you have only a year later, a broader definition of e-cigarettes to include the second, third, and fourth generation. And look at how the youth rates the use of e-cigarettes is increasing. And so this graph shows the trends in somebody ever using an e-cigarette among U.S. middle and high school students. And so the trend is that it's continuing to grow, and kids are using these things more than ever before. Why are people using them? In 2012, this study was conducted, and people were using them because they thought that maybe they weren't as bad for their health as cigarettes. They thought they might help them quit. 80% at that time were using them for those reasons. And then you go ahead just a couple years, and people are still thinking that they may not be bad for their health and that they might be useful to help them quit smoking. Spend a minute talking about what's in the e-liquid or the e-juice solution. The base of these solutions is either propylene glycol or vegetable glycerol. And both of these compounds are approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and are considered generally regarded as safe for use in the products that they're used in. And both of these compounds are used a lot in for cosmetic purposes. The e-liquid solutions also contain varying amounts of nicotine, flavorings, coloring agents, impurities, and other additives. So here's an example of the propylene glycol. It's a pharmaceutical solvent. It's added to different foods, and it, again, is generally regarded as safe by the Food and Drug Administration for use when eating it or when used in the hand sanitizer cosmetic products that it's used in. Vegetable glycerol, or glycerin, is glycerol from vegetables. It's used as a sweetener. It's also a food preservative, and it's also used in personal care products, conditioners, and things that make your skin smooth. So a study was done they took 5 e-cigarette juices, liquids, and they determined that the majority of them had this base of propylene glycol. Nicotine levels were varied throughout the different recipes. They contained some glycerol, some tobacco essence, and organic acids. So the problem with propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin, and really the problem with these e-juices, is nobody knows what happens once they're heated. And so even though they're considered as safe and in the products that they're approved for, what happens when you put these products in, you heat them, you vaporize them, you're really changing the chemical composition. And so again, nobody really knows what could happen because the studies just aren't out there on them. But they have found in some of the toxicants that are released in the vapor, they tested 12 brands of e-cigarettes, and they found that these e-cigarette vapors contained cytotoxins and carcinogens, including carbenols, VOCs, and PAHs. And those are just polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and those are all carcinogens that are also found in tobacco smoke. Although the levels that they did find were much lower than that in cigarette smoke, they still were present. So a systematic review of the health effects of e-cigarettes, high variability of the nicotine levels. That's one thing that is really hard to gauge and really hard to determine how much nicotine people are actually getting from these e-cigarettes. The carcinogens, again, they're found in the flavorants as well. Tobacco-specific nitrosamines are the TSNAs, and they were present in most samples. Again, in much lower levels than found in cigarettes, but these carcinogens were also found in e-liquid, e-juices. And then you have the concern of the metals and particles that break off once these e-cigarettes are heated. What happens when people are inhaling things such as lead, tin, chromium, nickel, and aluminum. A few additional health concerns. High levels of formaldehyde were detected when they were released when heated at high temperature. E-cigarettes have also been associated with a significant increase in airway resistance. There's a potential to induce inflammation in the cells in the lungs, and harmful effects that are similar to those that have been observed in people that are smokers and have COPD. Another concern, the lithium batteries, they blow up. I'm sure you've heard of some of the stories of lithium batteries blowing up on airplanes. You know, now they say before boarding an airplane, no e-cigarettes are allowed on board for various these safety concerns. Across the country, across the world, there is also various opinions about e-cigarettes. So this is an article from the UK, and in the UK, their opinion is that e-cigarettes are less harmful than tobacco, and that they promote the use of e-cigarettes over in the UK. Now, the European countries, the EU, the European countries, have a different stance, and they're really trying to get their e-cigarettes regulated as we are in the United States here. A few countries have banned them altogether. Singapore is an example where e-cigarettes have been banned. So final thoughts regarding the safety of e-cigarettes. The short-term data suggest that, yeah, they may be safer than combustible cigarettes. But what isn't? If you think about it, what isn't safer than a cigarette, right? They may cause airway disease and expose users to various toxins. And really the long-term health risk is not known because of the studies that are still being undertaken. They're still too new in the industry. And there's really no regulatory oversight, which is going to be changing. May 2016, the FDA came out that, yes, they want to start regulating e-cigarettes like they do other tobacco products. One thing about in the United States, e-cigarettes are marketed as and will be regulated as tobacco products. In some of the other countries, like the UK, they're not regulated like tobacco products. They're regulated like treated like a consumer product, and so they don't have the added regulation as tobacco products do. We're still in the middle of the regulation. Want to increase, the minimum age to prevent sales to underage youth. There's some states across the country that are, you see the American Cancer Society outside of the door and really trying to promote the increase of smoking age to 21 in Minnesota. Also, I would like to see that for the e-cigarettes as well. Across the country, smoking rates, there have been laws in, I think, 4 states, Hawaii, California. I think there's 2 states out east that they're the legal age to purchase cigarettes and e-cigarettes is now 21, and that's a push across the country as well. But we're going to see more of that. Again, like I said, the FDA is kind of in the middle of this. There's proposed legislation. It just takes time, unfortunately. It takes longer than we would like. So the key points are that, it's a battery-powered device that vaporizes nicotine or non-nicotine solutions for inhalation. Again, what are the effects of inhaling things like that into your lungs? there's really a lack of evidence for safety and efficacy, though research is growing and we're still waiting for more evidence to come forward. Right here at Mayo Clinic, if somebody were to come to me and talk about, cessation and ask about e-cigarettes, our recommendation is we do not recommend them, just because of the fact that, what if there are, drastic health issues related, and we don't want that to happen to any of our patients. So, and stay tuned for more heightened regulations. Hopefully, will impact the future of e-cigarette development and marketing. The good news is, with all of this, is that there's hope for everybody if they quit smoking or using tobacco. Almost immediately, within 20 minutes of somebody stopping smoking, their heart rate drops. And one of the big concerns with smoking is the carbon monoxide that somebody gets every time they light up. And within 12 hours of quitting, that carbon monoxide level in your bloodstream it drops to normal level. And so almost immediately, people start getting more oxygen delivered into their system when the carbon monoxide is gone. And that's great news. And as time goes on, down the road, the health benefits continue. Questions?
I'm wondering about the role of the tobacco industry with e-cigarettes. Are they the ones who are actually manufacturing the e-cigarettes, or are they just sponsoring them? Or?
Yeah, tobacco manufactures many of the e-cigarettes.
Okay.
For example, there's blue e-cigarettes. They're manufactured by the tobacco industry. Even before 2003, before this Chinese pharmacist took the lead on the e-cigarette, the tobacco industry had developed products similar to that, but they just hadn't come out with it. But yeah, the tobacco industry is behind a lot of the e-cigarette development. And, they say that they're excited, that they want people off of smoking. But what happens is you get people hooked on nicotine. And especially for the young population that these things are highly targeted for, that's a problem. And it can be a gateway drug to potential use of other products that contain nicotine.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, if they're behind it and eventually if they are more highly regulated and they're more expensive, it would just be a natural shift for younger populations, well, for anybody really, to move over to cigarettes, so they would have a lot to gain by that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I don't trust the tobacco industry. It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Any other questions? Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.